Okay, so now we're finishing out lecture 13 by talking about taste. Taste is also known as your gustatory sense, so gustation or gustatory sense. And it's also important. We talked about how smell is important. Taste also helps us to find nutritious or energy dense food. So, evolutionarily, something that had a lot of calories in it would be highly valuable, which is why we love really sweet things because they are very energy dense. And to help us avoid rotten or toxic substances, a lot of plant compounds that are toxic to us taste very bitter and unpleasant. So that's really useful. And we have receptor cells for taste. They're not technically neurons, they are special receptor cells located both on the tongue, which you would think, but also in the pharynx or in our throat, in some tissues kind of around the mouth and behind it. So let's talk about taste buds on the tongue. So first of all, our tongue is covered with lingual, meaning of the tongue, papillae. A papilla is a little finger-like projection that's sticking up. So if you look closely at your tongue in the mirror, you can see there's all these little bumps. In the crevices between these little bumps are taste buds. And so we can see in this diagram from the limb textbook here. So here's one of those little papilla, those little finger-like projections sticking up. And in the crevice in between, we find a whole bunch of taste buds. And so each individual taste bud contains 3 different types of cells. This should sound kind of familiar. It contains taste receptor cells that have these little taste hairs on them, kind of like the cilia we saw with the olfactory receptor neurons. We also find supporting cells, and we also find basal cells. So the taste receptor cells are not themselves neurons, but obviously those basal cells are here to regenerate and replace them when they get damaged. And it turns out they're replaced about every couple of weeks. So about every 8 to 22 days, we have new taste receptor cells. So you can imagine our tongue, we've all burned our tongue on pizza, and those taste receptor cells probably take a hit, but luckily we can regenerate them. So the taste receptor cells, much like the olfactory receptor neurons, are specific. Now, what's interesting about taste is instead of having, 400 different types, we have 5. So we have 5 types of taste that we can perceive, and each category of taste receptor cells only will only respond to that particular taste or input. So we have salt taste receptor cells that can detect sodium because they actually have sodium channels on them. So when there's a lot of sodium in our saliva, that sodium goes in through those sodium channels and then activates the cell. We have taste receptor cells for sourness, and that is actually mediated through proton channels. So what's interesting about acidic foods, which tend to taste sour, so think a lemon, think vinegar, they taste sour, and that sour is because of the acidity of the food or whatever it might be. So acids have a lot of free hydrogen ions, and so those are going in through those channels and activating those cells. We also have taste receptor cells for sweet things. So molecules like sucrose and glucose that will trigger these bind to G protein coupled receptors, cause a series of things to happen inside the cell, which will then result in it sending a signal. So we can perceive sweet. We can also perceive bitter, also through G protein coupled receptors, and umami. So umami is this savory sense that you get, like think a turkey dinner with gravy and stuffing, lots of umami there. So mushrooms, lots of umami. So these last 3 are all G protein coupled receptors. And what's interesting is for umami, the thing that stimulates it is the molecule glutamate, the very same glutamate that we're using as neurotransmitters for vision and hearing. And so it's the same exact molecule. And so all of these different taste receptor cells, in response to whatever stimulus they are designed to respond to, will release a neurotransmitter. And then that's going to send the whole signaling cascade. So I talked about glutamate and how it's a neurotransmitter, but then you might also be wondering, hey, is that what's in MSG? So MSG is monosodium glutamate, and it is an additive that a lot of people will add to foods because it helps them taste so good, because it amps up that umami flavor. Now, some people have some sensitivities to MSG, and so they will avoid food or cooking that uses MSG because they may have sensitivity in terms of migraine headaches or some other types of symptoms they may get. But yeah, that's what activates your umami taste receptor cells. Okay, so the taste receptor cells are going to release a neurotransmitter. It's going to be either serotonin or, interestingly, ATP. But that then is going to synapse with the axon of a sensory neuron. Synapse with an axon. Yeah, I know, it's weird. Okay, now that sensory axon is going to be part of one of 3 different nerves, depending on which part of the tongue or the throat we're talking about. So here's a great way to remind ourselves of some of the cranial nerves we already learned about. So the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, taste is supplied by the facial nerve, so cranial nerve 7, which aside from taste does motor control, right, of the facial muscles. Then from the posterior third of the tongue back here, it's the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve number 9, which you might remember also is a mixed nerve, so it has sensory and motor, so it does taste from the posterior tongue, but it also supplies motor signals to the muscles of swallowing, so that glossopharyngeal, tongue and throat. And then, and we didn't talk about this before, the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, which I kind of glossed over when we talked about cranial nerves because it's complicated, but we're going to start talking about it this week. So the vagus nerve actually has sensory inputs of many different types, including from taste signals from the pharynx, so from kind of the back of the throat. So we have 3 different sensory nerves, basically. They're all mixed nerves, all 3 of these, but that are bringing these sensory signals, carrying those sensory axons into the brain. Okay, so what is the pathway? So we can see here on the left, we've got those 3 different nerves through which these sensory neuron axons are traveling. Now, the cell bodies of those sensory neuron axons are going to be located in ganglia. We're just going to kind of acknowledge that there are ganglia that they live in. And the axons themselves then continue on here, boom, into the medulla. So we've seen this before, right? We saw this with hearing kind of going into the medulla first. So they're going to go into the medulla and they are going to synapse there with a second order neuron. This should sound familiar from our somatosensory unit, which is then going to send its axon up to the thalamus, where it's going to meet the third order neuron, which is then going to send an axon and project to the primary taste cortex, or the gustatory cortex, which is deep in this lateral fissure. And so it's kind of in the borderland between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. So that's where the primary taste or gustatory cortex is located, and where we're going to have conscious awareness and perception of one of those 5 tastes. Now, the weird thing about the taste pathway is that it stays ipsilateral. We have learned that almost everything in our whole bodies crosses, right? It decusates, not taste. Taste stays on the same side. Weird, I know. Now you might be wondering, wait, 5 different tastes? I can tell the difference between a slice of pizza and a turkey dinner, right? So obviously we can taste more than 5 things. Actually, what you're perceiving there is flavor. And so flavor is a combination of many different things. So we've got the 5 different tastes, so salty, sour, sweet, bitter, and umami. So we have taste receptor cells sending that information coming in. But then we have mouthfeel, or the level of creaminess, which we get from fats or triglycerides in foods. They add that. And then there's texture of the food itself. Is it a crisp, crunchy apple or slice of celery, or is it a smooth and gelatinous bit of pudding or ice cream, right? We also can detect spicy things now through a couple of ways. One is, as we learned back in somatosensory, some of them will actually activate thermoreceptors. So capsaicin, the molecule in hot peppers, will actually activate the thermoreceptors for heat. So it's hot. And also nociceptors, so those C fibers, which can give you like that dull, kind of more achy pain, can be activated also by a lot of spicy foods. Lastly, aroma or odor. So our olfactory sense is a huge part of how we interpret the flavors of things. And so in the stories in the media assignments of people who don't have the ability to smell, they'll talk about how they can taste sweet and salty and bitter and savory and sour, and they can appreciate spicy things, and they can feel the textures of food, but that's it, right? So, chocolate and vanilla ice cream are going to taste basically exactly the same to them. They won't be able to tell the difference because they're both sweet and cold and creamy, and that's it. So our brain is combining all of this information that we're getting from somatosensory information, right? So in terms of the creaminess, the texture, is it activating thermoreceptors? Is it activating nociceptors? And then primarily the olfactory sense, which is informing our sense of flavor. Okay, so in summary, taste, we have these taste receptor cells on the tongue and the pharynx that will release neurotransmitters in response to the presence of certain triggering substances, which can be salt, protons or hydrogen ions in the case of sour, and then sweet, bitter, or umami, where different molecules will bind to those G protein coupled receptors. Umami is specific for glutamate. And then they are going to release neurotransmitter onto the axon of a sensory neuron that is traveling either in cranial nerve 7, 9, or 10, which will then come into the medulla, synapse with a second order neuron, stay ipsilateral, go up to the third order neuron in the thalamus, which is then going to send a signal to the primary taste or gustatory cortex, which is in that weird kind of frontal temporal area. And then the brain is using not only that taste information, but olfactory information, texture information, and other sensations, including visual sensations, actually, to help us determine flavor. All right, so that's it for lecture 13. I'll see you next time.